This is the global economy right now, one filled with debt, volatile stock markets, high costs of living, and low growth rates. And everyone seems to be seeing all of the potential doomsday scenarios in the near future, from stock market crashes to bigger global economic crashes. And those crashes are very possible and scary. But what if there is another potential scenario? One that is not talked about enough, that could turn the tide for the markets, economy, and humanity itself. Something that could be emerging that could change the timeline of the next few decades. So first of all, let's take a look at what's happening right now on a step-by-step basis. The total global debt, which includes government, corporate, and household debt, has surpassed $300 trillion, according to the Institute of International Finance. This represents more than 350% of the global GDP, and also, just for perspective, all of the gold on the planet Earth currently is worth only about $12.7 trillion, or just about 4% of the global debt. And to break this down further, in 2024, global public debts stand at over $90 trillion, with many countries facing challenges related to debt servicing as interest rates have risen due to global monetary tightening. And the comparison here is that it's estimated that one human colony on Mars would take about $1 trillion to set up, so theoretically, the public debt right now is worth 90 human colonies on the Martian planet. Global corporate debt comprises nearly $100 trillion, and household debt comprises nearly $60 trillion. What I'm trying to get at here is that there's almost an incomprehensible amount of debt in the world, and it's been the fastest growing sector of the global economy over the last 4 years. But if we extend it out further, the IMF stated that the global debt to GDP ratio has actually tripled since the 1970s. And for many, this is viewed as a ticking time bomb because we are already at a point where governments are paying off debt by taking out more debt to pay off previous debts. Something that if you were to do yourself, it would be viewed as irresponsible. But when the government does it, it's just business. And this is worrying because some people think we are heading into a debt spiral where at some point either all debts will go towards paying off debts and not funding government programs, or the world will default on its debt at the same time, and we just see the greatest collapse of a global economy in the history of time. But what if all these things? What if that's not the only scenario? Yes, I have shown you times when the largest empires in the world have collapsed under debt, like the Roman Empire, where nearing the end of its empirical reign, it had a crushing amount of debt that it could no longer pay off. However, one part that isn't talked about much is that Rome actually had a period of time where it was under crushing debt after it was founded, but it was actually able to not only avoid economic collapse, but it actually went through a golden age. You see, early on in the Roman Empire, Rome became loaded with debt to fund wars and infrastructure projects. And also, men who joined the military saw their households have to take on debt to survive while they were on a military campaign. And after decades of debt accumulation, some reforms began to take place. The abolition of debt slavery happened, where people no longer had to become literal slaves if they could not pay off their debts in time. Instead, property would be revoked to pay off debt, something that still happens quite often today. Now, the empire obviously gained vast amounts of wealth after every successful conquest, but it also did a few other things. Emperors began gifting land to military veterans and other citizens for free. Imagine if the government just came by, knocked on your door, and gave you a $100,000 land plot to build a house if you wanted. That was commonplace during this time. The Emperor Tiberius Gracchus took this a step further by also limiting the amount of land that the rich and powerful could hold, and began redistributing this land to those that were extremely poor or had high debts. Now, Emperor Gaius Gracchus, the brother of Tiberius Gracchus, also began doing economic reforms to help alleviate debts from the poor by subsidizing grain prices and limiting the power of the Senate and influence of the wealthy on economic policy. Several times they also enacted debt moratoriums, essentially pausing debt repayments for those that could not pay. And lastly, strict loan regulations were put in place so predatory lenders could no longer exploit the middle class and the poor. A combination of all of these things, from economic reforms to infrastructure projects to military conquests, they led to Rome becoming, well, the Roman Empire that we study in history classes today. And it was only able to become the Roman Empire after overcoming a high debt burden by enacting economic reforms and having successful military conquests. Now today, military conquests and getting spoils of war is not exactly a good idea for any nation and will not be promoted by myself. But maybe, if governments were to enact drastic economic reforms, maybe the world could alleviate their debt levels in a way that doesn't involve devaluing their own currency or printing money, which is what governments seem to be doing right now. But now the next thing I want to talk about here is the potential to tackle the current cost of living crisis, as well as the cost of energy and the energy crisis. In 2024, energy costs have reached unprecedented levels. Natural gas prices, especially in Europe, are up over 300% compared to pre-pandemic levels. To put this into perspective, the average household in the European Union is now spending more on energy than at any time since the 1970s oil crisis. Back then, energy prices spiked dramatically due to an embargo by oil-producing nations, leading to long lines at gas stations and a push for energy conservation. Today's situation, while different in origin, is similarly straining budgets, with some households spending up to 30% of their income on energy, a figure that has doubled since 2020. In developing nations, where energy costs already took a larger share of household income, the impact is even more severe. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, some families now spend over 50% of their income on energy, including fuels for cooking and transportation. This is reminiscent of the 19th century reliance on coal and wood, but with the added burden of modern expectations and inflation. The cost of living in 2024 has reached heights not seen since the high inflation of the 1970s and early 1980s, when the world last saw inflation rates consistently above 10%. Today, inflation rates are hovering at around 6 to 8% in many developed countries, with food, housing, and transportation costs driving up this increase. Housing affordability is at a crisis point. In cities like London, Toronto, New York, and Sydney, housing prices have surged by over 50% in the past 5 years. Rent now consumes upwards of 40% of the average household income in these urban centers. If the Roman plebeians had faced such housing costs, their cries for reform might have come centuries earlier. But one of my favorite historical examples of solving an energy crisis and a cost of living crisis is something that I've always wanted to put into a video and have never been able to until now. You see, Britain in the 1600s and 1700s had wood as arguably their most important resource. It was used for everything: housing, cooking, heating, brewing, glassmaking, shipbuilding. Pretty much anything in the British economy was reliant upon wood. And as the British Empire began to expand, the demand for wood skyrocketed, and the supply, caused by deforestation, began to dwindle. The price of wood surged, and so did the cost of everything that used wood, which was pretty much everything. A piece of firewood became so expensive that it became unaffordable to buy it to heat your home in the winter for some families in Britain. So, people began looking for new and cheaper alternatives to heat their homes, and to use for industrial purposes, and well, that created the industry that we know now as the coal industry. Britain's government and businesses began to rapidly expand its new coal technology in order to tackle the energy crisis. And over the coming years and decades, this adoption of coal helped lead to lower energy prices, lower costs of living, a thriving middle class, and the adoption of a new age called the Industrial Revolution. You see, when faced with an energy crisis and a cost of living crisis, Britain turned to a new technology and innovation in order to tackle the problem. It transitioned into a new, cheaper form of energy, which helped build its empire. But today, something like that, even though it might be necessary, it is frowned upon by both a significant portion of the public and governments around the world. For example, a poll in the UK showed that only 41% of the UK population supports the expansion of the oil industry, even if it leads to lower prices. I mean, right now, cheap energy sources like solar, wind, and hydro, they are growing quite fast. However, the ability to store that energy and those energy sources' reliability are still not quite to the point where household electricity is significantly cheaper than it would be with gas, coal, or oil. However, sometimes it is. During some heat waves in the last 12 months, countries like Greece and Belgium have had between 30% and 130% of their energy needs met by just solar energy. Yes, solar energy in Belgium actually produced more energy than the entire country needed during a heat wave. It is worth noting that a large chunk of the world's energy does go to things like oil and gas for things like cars, planes, ships, and so on. So even though the world is moving away from fossil fuels, or is trying to, it is still highly dependent on them. And therefore, costs will remain high unless some drastic change to either the supply or demand happens. Or unless some innovation happens, which may have actually already occurred. Scientists at the Nuclear Fusion Lab in the United States are achieving nuclear fusion reactions fairly consistently now. And for those that aren't scientifically inclined, nuclear fusion is pretty much the holy grail of energy production. It's how the sun produces its energy. It's about 5 times more efficient than our current nuclear reactors and produces very little radioactive waste in comparison. Essentially, this energy source was a dream for economists and scientists alike for the last 100 years. But within the last 12 months, that dream may have become a reality. And so what this could mean for you is, well, this. The average person could potentially see a lower household energy cost by 50 to 90%. Imagine potentially, in a decade or two, having your home utility bill go from $100 a month now to $10 a month. And to have all factories and industries also experience this cost savings. That is something that could be on the horizon. A 90% reduction in energy cost. And who knows, maybe this technological innovation will catapult other industries to make better electric cars that can use nuclear fusion, or things like electric cargo ships and planes, which I've already talked about in previous videos. So the moral of the story is this: things seem dire right now. The global economy is in the rut, and things might get even worse. But there is hope for the future. You'd be surprised how often innovation in science bails out the economy and leads to prosperity. I mean, if you are my age, could you have ever imagined how important the internet would have become to the economy? Especially this fast? In 1999, it only represented 1% of the global economy, and the average person really only bought stuff from eBay. But by about 2014, just 15 years later, the entire world's economy essentially revolved around the internet in one way or another. So who knows, maybe nuclear fusion becomes the new coal, maybe economic reforms get us out of this economic crisis, and maybe something like robotics or artificial intelligence will be the new industrial revolution. I don't know, but something might be brewing or emerging from the depths of these economic times. Whatever it may be, it could lead humanity to a golden era of prosperity, hope, and togetherness. If you liked this video, please click on my documentaries playlist, as I have a ton of other videos just like this on there. And please hit that subscribe button and that notification bell if you want to see my next video, which should be out fairly soon. So click on my playlist, and I'll see you guys in my next video in just a few seconds.